morning. Good morning. Let me just set up my screen here. So I'm hoping that my energy picks up because this is this is my one of my favorite people to present on. I've got to admit, so I thought that there were other chapters that were pretty challenging. I was challenged by this, and I'm just going to tell you why ahead of time. I was challenged by these chapters because I'm newer to IFS. I'm in the middle of my training right now, and I've been working with dissociation for a really long time. And somebody said to me, when you go in and you start grounding your clients, you kind of are ignoring the dissociation. And really what we want to do is we want to work with it. And I thought, oh, well, that kind of makes sense from an IFS perspective, right? And so that's what these chapters are about. And so I got to admit, I was like, oh, this feels really uncomfortable. And change is at the end of our comfort zone. So for those of you that work with me, know that that's a good thing. So anyway, that's what we're going to be delving into today. And it's fascinating, to be honest with you. So once again, Frank has done a really great job of bringing these topics to us. So let's get started. Chapter 14 is about vulnerability. And the two key components of vulnerability, and we're thinking about this from an IFS, internal family systems perspective, is one's going to be about self-connection, acknowledging and accepting our genuine feelings, and then sharing with others, which obviously is going to be that external piece. This brings me hope. We've got a pretty chaotic external environment. A lot of our clients come in and they're just not really sure what to do. And it gives me hope because I know that the work needs to start here. And so we want to start with our internal selves. And that's something we can do. We can't change people, places, things in the external world, but we can change ourselves. And so that's amazing and awesome. And then so connection, self-connection, and then sharing with others, expressing our truth without fear of judgment. So learning to hold boundaries and learning to be in co-connection in our ventral vagal parasympathetic state. And then looking at the risk reward, the risk of being rejected, that fear of rejection, shame, and criticism. And we all know where that comes from. If that's how it worked when we were younger, then we of course would think that's how it works now. And then the reward is a deeper intimacy, greater confidence, and overall well-being. It's probably on another slide here, but one of the things that Frank made me really think about is, we can do really great work to get our clients to be more independent, not to be so codependent. They become more self-reliant. But what happens is they feel so great that that's where it stops. The idea of going out and getting into another relationship, it's like, oh, no, I don't know. I'm good. Thank you. Been there, done that. Feeling good, feeling safe, feeling independent, have a really great relationship with myself. Taking that next step and sharing with others is something that we therapists have to really try to encourage a lot of our clients to do once we get to that point. When it comes to vulnerability, Brene Brown is our gal, PhD in social work. You don't find that very often. Back in the day before she became very famous, she used to come visit us here in the North Shore of Chicago and speak. I think I've seen her speak 3 times. So anyway, here she is, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how to embrace vulnerability.
Ashley, we make it feel good to be home.
Hoff, seriously?
Hold on one second.
Hoffman!
Nothing is for free.
We think about vulnerability as a dark emotion. There are a lot of people who talk about positive emotions negative emotions, dark emotions, light emotions. We think of vulnerability as a dark emotion. We think of it as the core of fear and shame and grief and disappointment, uncertainty, things that we do not want to feel, right? Things that I don't want to be vulnerable because that means I'm afraid. That means I'm uncertain. That means I'm at risk. I'm exposed. I'm in grief. So what we do is we armor up and we say, I do not want to slip into these dark emotions. I will not let myself be vulnerable. But here's what I learned from the research and certainly put into motion in my own life that was the most life-changing, is that vulnerability is the center of difficult emotion. But it's also the birthplace of every positive emotion that we need in our lives. Love, belonging, joy, empathy. How many of you would agree that we're in a serious empathy deficit in our culture today? Totally, right? No vulnerability, no empathy. In a culture where people are afraid to be vulnerable, you can't have empathy. You know, empathy is not a default response. If you share something with me that's difficult, in order for me to be truly empathic, I have to step into what you're feeling. And that's vulnerable. So there can be no empathy without vulnerability. Why do you think, in that example that I used a while ago, daughter comes home and says, you know, tears, no one sat with me at lunch today. They made fun of what I was wearing. So-and-so won't talk to me. They poured my books out of my locker. And the response back is, I told you, I bought you all those cute jeans. Why aren't you wearing those jeans? And pull your hair back. Is that an empathic response? No, it's a shaming response. Could that shaming response be at the, could a mother who absolutely adores her child respond with that shaming response? Please say yes, don't kid yourself. I mean, come on. If you're a parent sitting in here, then you sure as hell know the answer to that is yes. But why? Why did that happen? Where was the access to vulnerability? Where was empathy? You can't access empathy if you're not willing to be vulnerable. So if my daughter comes home and tells that to me, guess what I have to do? I have to reactivate that sweaty palmed 7th grader who lives inside me. And I have to go, oh God, that's so hard. I'm so sorry. That's happened to me. That's happened to me when I was in middle school, and it's happened to me last week. Let's talk about it. But you can't get there without vulnerability. You can't fake empathy. Innovation and creativity, born of vulnerability. This is my favorite part. I talked about this I did another TED Talk.
Okay, so that's all we were going to watch. If you want to get the link, Eric will send it to you
this year.
But at the end of the day, I love how she speaks. She just, those pauses and her body language and her facial expressions. She's really a beautiful presenter. But at the end of the day, she made the point that we needed to hear, that it's all about vulnerability. I always end my trainings with change is at the end of your comfort zone. So go out and get super uncomfortable. We need to be vulnerable in order to be in healthy relationships. We need to be vulnerable in order to be good therapists. We need to be vulnerable in order to be good teachers. So vulnerability is everywhere, and it doesn't feel good because it activates. 20/80 rule tells us that 20% of what we're feeling is about today, but 80% comes from the past. So whatever it is that your client may be experiencing, or whatever it is that people in your life are experiencing, or maybe the world is experiencing, it's constantly activating our own experiences. Frank also makes a comment about, we're not in this business because we like to hear the stories. We're in this business because we also have been hurt and experienced trauma, most likely. And so it's really important for us to be able to make those connections. One of the things that internal family systems has done for at least me personally is really made it clear that my own work, yes, I've done a ton of EMDR, but my own parts work has been really important because there are very, very young, vulnerable parts that never got touched with EMDR, probably because those protectors are so good. Okay, but anyway, let's continue. So, personal experience. The author's journey, Frank, as a gay man with a trauma history. He's written a whole book about it. And so it's an ongoing process of expanding authenticity and finding a higher happiness quotient. And so if you want to hear his story, his book's been out for a while now. It's kind of where his focus is. But this is all part of his internal family systems journey, figuring him out himself. And of course, he works with the best. Dick Schwartz, I believe, was his therapist. And then lifelong growth. Vulnerability means an ever evolving practice. So, continued therapy fosters greater connection with self and others. Some in therapy just feel like, just like they go and they work out every 3 times a week, that they're probably going to be in therapy for a lot of their life because it's always changing, developmentally and otherwise, not to mention what goes on in the external world. Understanding relational trauma. So, a violation of healthy, loving connection is where we focus. So we want to focus on what we call a perpetrator's reaction to victim's vulnerability, not the vulnerability itself. So I always say, when I used to do quite a bit of work in my area with bullying, and we were always trying to focus on the bully. We're always trying to have the student tell the teacher, tell the cafeteria monitor if there's bullying going on. But no, it's the perpetrator's reaction to the victim's vulnerability. It's get the victim into therapy so that they can, come out with a body language that doesn't say, mess with me on their forehead. And so focusing on that vulnerability, that gives us so much hope. Once again, because your clients are coming in, this is something we can do. We can work with our clients' internal world, their internal family. Common in childhood trauma, where the victim internalizes perpetrators' negative responses. And so not only do we not have control of what we're exposed to at home, but we're not in control of what we're exposed to in our environment, depending on where we are in our life. But with therapy, you are learning to interpret what it is that's happening, and then how you're responding to it and why you're responding to it in that way. Victims often adopt the perpetrator's viewpoint. So we say it's their viewpoint as their self-criticism, but also the victim will pick up the behaviors as well. And we call this perpetrator imitator parts or parental imitator parts. I always freak out the basic trainees, especially the interns, when I start to talk about this in the training. If I grew up with someone who was yelling all the time, I have a part of me that not only knows how to yell really well, and I have a part of me that knows how to yell at me like I was yelled at, but also knows how to yell at others. And the reason that happens is because when we talk about neurons that fire together, fire, wire, fire, wire, we have what's called neuronal bundles, which are basically parts. And those parts, if you were yelled at when you were a kid and you felt horrible, but then you went to school and you yelled at your best friend and that made you feel better, basically we have a reward system that's going to say, oh, yelling is great. Yelling is great. It makes you feel empowered. And look at how that person feels. And this feels so much better because when I'm at home, I am feeling so vulnerable and scared. That's how our parts evolve. Our parts evolve because we learn to yell at home. We go to school, we yell. It feels good because that didn't feel good. And now we have these neurons that are firing and wiring and firing and wiring. And the next thing you know, you yell, and now you're yelling like you were yelled at home. And then shame comes in, which is a chapter for next time. So it's very interesting how that works. And at the end of the day, it's all in service of survival. I also like to use the example of lying. You have a young child that has to lie all the time to avoid getting yelled at, getting hit, getting pushed across the room, being sent to their room. And so they just automatically start to say things that aren't true to avoid this. They don't even know what lying is. Once again, and it's dopamine, if you want to know what the neurotransmitter is, but literally the reward system is rewarding the client because that client's victim part is feeling empowered. I can avoid being hit if I lie. I can avoid being yelled at or pushed if I lie. So the lying and the lying and the lying it's a coping strategy. It's what protects the client. And now you have a 35-year-old, mother that does a lot of lying. She doesn't know it's in service of survival. It's a part. We call it a perpetrator imitator part, or a parental imitator part, or a coping strategy in service of survival. All of these things are here for a reason. So the confusion over responsibility, victims, especially children, mistakenly take on the responsibility for the abuse and the neglect. And we all know that. Kids blame themselves. It's my fault. I must have done something wrong. And distorted beliefs about self-worth and self-identity stem from misassigned responsibility. So once again, if I need to be perfect in order to get the attention of my parents, if I need to make sure I get good grades, or if I need to act out to get the attention of my parents, or if I need to be suicidal to get the attention of my parents, or I need to self-harm to get the attention of my parents, remember that dopamine, there's a book called Dopamine Nation for a reason. It reinforces and it rewards the client in a way that is in service of their survival, because that's all they're trying to do, is figure out how to survive. Before I go into attachment versus authenticity, which those of you that work with me, it's like one of my favorite topics. I'm going to throw something out there to really freak you out, but I feel like I can do it here because you're there and I'm here. So if you have a client that's been sexually abused since a very young age, you can be sure that they have a part that can mimic or copy that sexual abuser, perpetrator, imitator part. Fast forward, let's say that client gets a job in a preschool, and that client is an aide and is responsible for taking those children to the bathroom and to oversee and make sure that everything's okay. And these are young children. It wouldn't be shocking if that client doesn't experience some type of arousal or some type of curiosity around these children, because they were abused. It's what they know. And in order for them to survive a perpetrator that sexually abuses them for a majority of their childhood, they have to be able to think and anticipate and to copy that perpetrator to a T in order to stay safe. And these are neurons that fire and wire. It's unconscious. And then the client shames themselves, and they would never tell their therapist, ever, ever, ever. And at the end of the day, this is completely natural. So I just had to throw that out there. Okay. Attachment versus authenticity. Conflict between the need for attachment and the drive for authenticity. I always forget the author of the book, but basically what he said was, we're too busy trying to save ourselves and just to figure out how to stay alive than to figure out who we're supposed to be in this world and what we're supposed to do with our life. A lot of times you get clients that come in that are like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing here. And so they haven't had the time or the motivation or the drive or the opportunity to even think about who they are, because at the end of the day, they're just trying to stay alive. So survival often leads to choosing attachment over authenticity, which means you are suppressing your true self. You are sacrificing your true self, not purposely, but especially when we start looking at polyvagal in the autonomic nervous system, it takes over and it is all about keeping the client safe. And it's shifting all over the place to different states, one to another, to another, to another, based on what their neuroception or their hypervigilance is picking up on. And a lot of us live in very triggering environments. Some have lived in triggering environments their whole life. Some feel like they're going to be entering into more triggering environments. So at the end of the day, we may not have time to think about like, who am I? What would I like for myself? So another favorite, some of you have already seen this. It's a short and sweet one. It's on my website. Gotta always honor Gabermonte when it comes to authenticity and attachment.
When the child is born, the child has two needs. The first need is for attachment. And attachment is contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Any mammalian child or even an avian child doesn't survive. So that as soon as you get past the level of reptiles, the reptile is hatched, the mother's long gone by then, and the reptile infant either lives or dies, but there's no attachment to a parenting figure. As soon as you get to the level of birds now, the baby bird has to have an attachment with the parents. The parents have to be attached to the baby. Otherwise, the infant simply does not survive. Mammalians even more so, and most so the human, because we're the least developed, the least mature, with the least developed brains, and the most dependent for the longest period of time of any creature in the universe. So our attachment needs are enormous, and they remain important throughout lifetime because we have to have attachments to form societies, social groups, without which we don't survive. So attachment is a huge need. We have to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. That's just a basic human need. But we have another need as well, which is for authenticity. Authenticity is the capacity, as I said earlier, to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are and manifest who we are in our activities and in our relationships. Now, why is that? Well, think of a human being in the evolutionary period who's not in touch with their body and their gut feelings. How long do they survive out there in the wild? So authenticity is another huge survival need. Great. So far, so good. But what happens to a child where the attachment need is not compatible with the need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel and insist on my own truth, my parents can't handle it. And parents convey those messages unconsciously all the time. Not because they mean to, not because they don't love the child, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because they themselves are suppressed, or traumatized, or hurt, or stressed. So I convey that message many times to my children, believe me, without any conscious desire to do so. In fact, it was the very opposite of what I wished to convey. But that they're not acceptable the way they are, with their emotions the way they are, that's the message my kids got when they were small. And most children get that in our society. Now, what does a child do with that? Well, if I give up my attachment for the sake of authenticity, I lose my relationships on which my life depends. Therefore, there's no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. And then we become 25 and 30 or 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. And somebody asks us, what do you feel? You say, I have no idea. And how many times we've all had the experience of having an inkling of a strong gut feeling, but we're ignoring it and we get into trouble. Well, that tells us what happened. What happened was that at some point we found out that it was too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So then it becomes not our first nature, but our second nature, to suppress our feelings, to lose touch with ourselves, and to suppress our gut feelings. And then we pay the cost later on in the form of addictions, mental illness, or any range of physical illnesses. But it all began with this tragic conflict that children should never be confronted with, but are all the time, between authenticity on the one hand and attachment on the other. And even as adults, so many people are suffering because they want to be themselves, but they're afraid to be because they know, or at least they fear, that if they're themselves, they're going to lose important attachment relationships in their lives.
All right, Gabar. All right. So consequences of misaligned messages. So once again, the messages that you're receiving. I think one of the things that was a takeaway in shame, because I did start the chapter, is that shame is the disconnection. You can't be in connection with a human if you are feeling shame. And shame is everywhere, and it's generational. And so making those connections are super important, because that's where the client can then let go of this idea of needing to survive and can start embracing like who they are. Okay, so consequences of misaligned messages. Receiving messages that conflict with one's true self leads to disconnection and internalization of false beliefs. And so a lot of us here are EMDR therapists, and at the end of the day, or you work on schemas, and we're looking for those beliefs, even the exiles, if you're looking at internal family systems. What is it that the client does believe about themselves, and where did that come from? So if I am worthless, or I'm invisible, or I'm unimportant, or I'm going to die, or I am defective, these are the messages that are given to us, and these are the messages that we embrace. Remember, neurons that fire together wire together. And so if I'm given this message enough, I'm going to walk around with neuronal networks that are basically a part, and that part is going to embrace and believe in whatever that belief is. Protector parts develop to handle these emotional misalignments and isolation. So, I gave the example of lying, but another example would be not being able to get any type of attention whatsoever. Let's say that you're neglected, but you realize that if you start acting up, if you look mom in the eye and then you do something she doesn't like, and all of a sudden she gets up and starts running after you, yelling at you, you aren't going to make a decision based on if that yelling is good or bad. You're just going to know that that's attention, and that attention will then get reinforced. And once that's reinforced, you're going to do it over and over and over again. Because look, mom's chasing me. How fun is that? Goals of our internal family systems is to reconnect the client with their authentic selves. So the first thing we do is with the psychoeducation, just like we're doing right now, when we talk about how these parts of us evolved to begin with. We want to honor every single part of us because it evolved out of something. It evolved out of somewhere in service of our survival. So we want to, our goal is, like I said, to reconnect the clients with their authentic self and help the clients trust their feelings and dismantle any internalized false beliefs. The best way to do that is to make that past-present connection, to be able to find that 20/80. Hey, you call yourself lazy and say that you're no good. And by the way, do you remember that you told me your dad used to say the same thing to you over and over and over again? And now we've got Daniel Siegel's Name It to Tame It, because the client's like, oh my gosh, you're right. No wonder I do that. So I always say you're not born with that language. So we want to validate the client's experience, then to foster that self-acceptance and healing. We just start to explain to them that if you have somebody that tells you something over and over and over again, it's encoded in your brain. It's literally a recording that's basically being blasted at you by you, because that's what you were taught growing up when your brain was developing. Rebuilding trust and self-leadership. The restoration of trust in one's inner wisdom and self-leadership is crucial for recovery. So one thing that internal family systems does bring to this table is this concept of higher self. This higher self is our leadership, and it's not a part. We can have self-led parts or self-like parts that are led by self. And I think that a lot of us are running into those. Maybe I think the higher self is something that you really want to spend some time specifically working on. But at the end of the day, that is our inner wisdom, and that is our self-leadership. And that is what we need to build first. And we emphasis on the therapist validation and acknowledgement of the client's true perceptions is going to be a part of that. It's going to be a piece of that. We're going to be mentoring for the client how to be a higher self and what that looks like, and also be able to help the client understand and see where some of these other aspects of them came from. It's important to determine if vulnerability comes from the self or a part, because parts-driven vulnerability often has intensity and a specific agenda. So if you have a part that has an agenda, then it is a part. If you have an essence or a core that has no judgment, then you are in self. So understanding the difference, this is a tough one. And at the end of the day, it's not super essential to get the clarity around it until it starts to evolve and you're able to point it out. So, working with what our goals are with self, higher self, but also knowing what the aspects of a part are. Is it driven? Does it have a goal? Is it judgmental? Because self, higher self is not a part. Typically, parts-driven vulnerability typically seek recovery for past hurts. So at the end of the day, what you're vulnerable to most likely comes from where you were hurt in the past. And you're going to look to recover. You're constantly looking for some type of way to remedy the issue. And that's kind of how we get into, like, say, for example, imago theory when looking at couples. You marry your parents because your parents basically created these wounds and you're looking to recover. And so how do we get in that position? Well, we end up with the same kind of people that basically treated us the way we were treated as kids with this intention of healing. And we all know how well that works. That's why, divorce rate is 50%. Likely to activate protective responses in others and reinforcing original wounds. So if you pick somebody that you were neglected as a child and then you find a partner that is really good at neglecting you and that feels so right and comfortable because that's what you experienced, then you also are going to be picking up what it is that their wounds look like. Why do they neglect to begin with? Well, probably because they were neglected. So now you got a whole family of neglect, and then it's generational. Common responses. I'm so lonely and afraid. Please stay with me. This would be an example of a response from an adult to their partner. And literally what it is a very, very young child, very young exile that's saying, I'm so lonely and afraid, please stay with me, because I cried and cried and cried and cried in my crib and nobody came in there and it was scary and my diaper wasn't changed and I didn't get fed and there was no one around. So you can see how this just past present connections just walk right into the relationships that you're in right now. And then more likely to elicit corrective and reparative responses. You've got this self-driven need to fix and repair. You're looking to get that hole in your heart filled. And so you're going to want to do it with the relationships that you've created for yourself, and the people that you're in relationship with are the ones that you're comfortable with, and they're the ones that basically do the same thing to you that was done to you when you were young. Past present connection once again. So more likely to elicit corrective and reparative responses. That's what you would like. Self acts as the ultimate protector and strength of our vulnerability. We as therapists want to say, you know what, we're not going to look at Joe, your partner, to help you with this because we can't change people, places, things. But what we do want to do is look internally for the recovery. We want to work with that vulnerable internally. And that's the gift that we bring our clients. And that will enable genuine connection to feelings and deepest thoughts. And at the end of the day, if your client decides to stay in those relationships, that's a whole other topic. So the role, Roxana, Eric, I should ask, are there any questions that are coming up? I think this is pretty self-explanatory.
You're plugging along great, Paula. No questions.
Okay, awesome. So the role of self in internal family systems, and I know there's a lot of great ways to do self state work, parts work, ego states and structural dissociation, and there's Jungian, and wait, there's one I'm missing off the top of my head. That's transactional analysis. And one of the reasons I personally am shifting toward internal family systems right now is this concept of higher self. I think it all depends on what fits your client. I have an aspect of self. Maybe I think I'm more connected to it than maybe I really am. But I do believe. I mean, this is me. Okay, I do believe in a higher energy that I'm connected to, and I do believe I have an aspect of me that's part of something that's bigger, and that higher self, like I said, is not a part. It's like an essence. It's like your core. It might be connected to like your soul plan, who knows? So the role of self in IFS is very different than if you're doing ego states or you're doing structural dissociation or you're doing transactional analysis, because we're working with states. And states of self are going to be like you have a therapist state, and you have a teacher state, and you have a parent state. These are going to be specific ego states, and they all have wonderful qualities. You can have a spiritual state. So it's the same thing-ish, except for this higher self isn't a part, and there's no such thing to have that in some of these other orientations. So Frank is key to IFS and self, and he's really grown his own self. And so we'll continue with that. So the self lowers guard and relaxes protectors. The self has better judgment on whom to trust with vulnerability. Now, we did say that higher self does not judge. So we want to be careful with that word, and helps clients see goodness in themselves and let go of past perpetrator influences. So you have this loving energy that's always there. They compare it to the sun. When the clouds move away, the sun is always there. So this has always been there. We just have layer after layer after layer after layer after layer of these protector parts that basically evolved out of complex trauma, which is what this book is about. So trauma often makes vulnerability appear risky or frightening. And then the self comes in and it helps reframe the vulnerability as a strength, like Brene Brown was talking about, not a weakness. We need vulnerability in order to be in a relationship, fostering greater connection and deeper intimacy. And it's part of the healing of the whatever the impact that trauma was. So embracing vulnerability can be really difficult when we're working with clients that are like done with being hurt, like they've put up their wall, like stay away, I don't want anymore. So we're going to move into this next chapter that's talking about reactions to trauma, because at the end of the day, we're saying we need to be vulnerable, but then these are people that are very injured, and they're like, no, we don't do vulnerable anymore. We've been there, done that. That did not work for us. And so this chapter, it's a beautiful chapter, a little complicated for me, but beautiful. So let's keep going. Chapter 15. We're going to be understanding protective parts here. So you've got all kinds of parts. Oh, Susan, how are you? I'm glad you found the link. What's up?
Thank you. Before you go to 15, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Because in ego state therapy, who's sitting at the head of the table if it's not the higher self?
It depends on what states show up. So it could, as you recall, when you were in that in the ego state training, we would have the therapist part there, and maybe you would have a spiritual part there, or a mother part there, or a career, whatever career you were in. Those are states, and the states are specific to that role. And that's the difference. There is a difference, because internal family systems, when we're talking about that higher self, it is not a part. And they don't have that in ego states.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe
in structural dissociation or in transactional analysis.
Well, so maybe I've been doing it wrong then.
I don't know that there is a wrong. What do I say? No mistakes, only feedback.
So yeah, so a lot of times I just, like I have the higher self there.
Okay.
In the state, and it's worked fine. It's actually
it probably would work fine, to be honest with you, because everybody has a higher self.
right.
So you can go into your meeting place with all your ego states and introduce a higher self. I just want to make sure that I'm clear on the language with the different orientations. So I totally can see where it works, and I would do that as well. But just know the difference in the language for if you're doing an ego state versus an IFS, conversation. I just want you to be able to know the difference.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you're welcome. Excellent. Yeah, it's confusing. I will not want to downplay how confusing it is. You can imagine how confusing it is for me, since I teach them all in one training. Okay, good. So excellent question too. Understanding protective parts in complex PTSD. on my own time. All right. So relational trauma, it's a profound violation of vulnerability. So when we talk about relational trauma, we are talking about complex PTSD. Just did a basic training this weekend, spent a lot of time talking about how here with the DSM-5, we have a PTSD and we have PTSD with a dissociative subtype, and we don't really have anything else when we're looking at complex trauma versus PTSD. This book is specific to complex trauma and some of the dissociative diagnoses. So when you're looking at complex trauma, we are looking at violations of vulnerability, trust, and feelings, which often result in, and I'm surprised they even put often, it results in layers and layers and layers of protector parts. So our goal is to help help the resistant protector parts relax and allow access to the wounded child part. So when you think about it, you have a very, very young part that was exposed to fear. That fear is then the protector part's going to come in and start building layers of protection to protect the whole system from experiencing that fear. And so at the end of the day, our goal is to get to the fear, but we can't do that without working through the protector parts first. So these parts guard vulnerable counterparts and often resist direct engagement. So to get to those wounded child, and they call them exiles, but Frank, talks about them as wounded children. It's the same thing. To get to them can be very, very difficult. In fact, we have a name for people like myself who didn't know very much about what they were doing in the very beginning. They're called exile hunters. I was an exile hunter. We need to slow it down. We all know with complex trauma, slow is fast. So we want to slow it down. You're going to see why in a few minutes. These parts guard vulnerable counterparts and often resist direct engagement, and they manifest in various forms, such as dissociative parts, which disconnect or numb the individual when danger is perceived. So when you think about a part that's dissociative, and we have to remember that right now we're talking about internal family systems, so this would be different in some of these other orientations, that the part is choosing to use dissociation to protect the client. So this is where polyvagal comes in, because you can either go into a sympathetic state, or you can go into a dorsal vagal shutdown state. For those of you that work with me, you either go into yellow or you go into red. And it is the part that picks. So you're going to have a part that chooses to go into sympathetic energy, working with the autonomic nervous system, or you're going to have a part that chooses to go into a dorsal vagal parasympathetic shutdown, and that is dissociation. So if your part is choosing this energy, that would suggest that you need to work with this part, which is something that's completely new for me. I've been working with this stuff for years, never occurred to me. So let's continue. Let's see if we can get there. So dissociation is a protective tool chosen by a part. There's mild, daydreaming, spacing out, preoccupation, but then there's severe, losing chunks of time, splitting into discrete identities. So it's a continuum. And the neurobiological foundation, and just bear with me here, is that, I loved it when we talked about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, because I've got that link. Amygdala's in the limbic system, prefrontal cortex and that neural cortex. The limbic system goes back to 250 million years ago, says Stephen Porges, the mammalian brain. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, which is now today with our reasoning and our current higher functioning cognitions and language. But now we're going to get into, Frank being Harvard educated is now taking us into more detail. And so the amygdala redirects information from the lateral to the basal nucleus. And I'm just like, what? What is that? But at the end of the day, it's more details associated with what happens specifically when we go into a dissociative shutdown. And the key here is that from the basal nucleus, which is part of the ventral stratum, Eric? Anyway, that the key is Do I have it right, Eric? Eric's our brain guy. Ventral stratum.
I would say stratum, but
Oh, stratum.
but it doesn't matter. There is a really good question, actually, Paula, and I think it needs some drawing out here.
Okay.
So
You're gonna leave me hanging here with this vocabulary, aren't you? You're not even gonna let me finish my sentence so I can go on.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No,
Finish
no,
your
no,
sentence,
no,
but
no,
I do.
no.
It's a good interrupting point. So
Okay, let me just finish the sentence so then I don't have to come back to it because this is the only sentence I don't know. And then we'll look at that question. But the ventral striatum,
there
the
you
key
go.
is that it's heavily influenced by dopamine. And remember, the dopamine is a big aspect of the reward system. It has a lot to do with addiction, and abuse, drug or alcohol abuse, or behavior addictions, in that it reinforces, but it can be very overwhelming. And it's what activates the dorsal vagal shutdown. It's what activates dissociation. So we're going to just end this slide with dissociation is seen in internal family systems as a part and not as a pathology. And now, Eric, take it away.
And this is exactly where I think the question is going. Can you say more about how the parts have a choice about which polyvagal state they are reacting from? I always thought of the transition between polyvagal states as involuntary. Intentional regulation back into yellow and green, but involuntary rising up into yellow and red.
Yes, it is involuntary because that part is already encoded with their reaction. And where that reaction came from was when they were growing up. So if dad yelled all the time and the protector part realized that yelling is what gets things done, then that's going to be a sympathetic energy. And that's where it came from. But if the yelling was way too much and so overwhelming and terrifying, and the client as a child would go into a dissociation, and that's where this piece comes in with the dopamine, it gets reinforced over and over and over again, and now the part is encoded with the sympathetic, the parasympathetic dorsal energy. Does that answer the question?
So there's a follow-up. So a choice initially in childhood. Well, I'm not sure that I agree with that part. So a choice initially in childhood becomes involuntary because of the neuronal connections in the brain.
Yes. So technically it's not a choice. Like there's no prefrontal cortex reasoning that's saying, well, if we do it this way, that would be better than if we did it this way. It's what did the client learn growing up? What did they utilize and what worked? I think the key is when we say choice, what I'm trying to emphasize is that these are parts that have very specific ways of protecting the wounded children, exiles, and that we need to determine which polyvagal energy they have in order for us to figure out what to do next.
Yeah, but coincidentally, the struggle that I am disagreeing with about choice in childhood, children don't have the ability to choose as much as their caregivers do.
So take the word choice out, because you're absolutely right. Nobody's choosing anything. It was just language to suggest that that the part houses this energy as a problem-solving strategy. And so I'll take the word choice out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would be doing too, versus this sort of back to this self energy. The self actually has the authority and has the sense of ability to manage all of those parts, versus this being within the context of a lower order brain function, maybe is
right.
Way of saying it, or childlike energy. So
okay. So as long as everybody is able to embrace the fact that this is a part and that this part is housing this this energy. And it's not, what's the word I'm looking for? It's unconscious. So it's not, the client doesn't even know it, but that's part of our job, is to teach it to them. So, yeah, Susan.
Okay. So this is a question that leads to my question, like what you guys were just talking about. So when I'm working on the trauma traffic light with clients, I've often wondered if different parts will have actually a different polyvagal response.
Yep.
And so like so then do we do multiple traffic lights with different parts?
No, you just use your red and you put the parts in the red. Like you've got different parts that use red, right? So when you're going over your red with your client, you're just going to say, well, you've got this part or you've got this part. You don't need to do different traffic lights.
No. Oh, but how can you possibly fit everything into one?
Well, then you would want to flip over the paper and continue. I mean, right?
Okay. Well, it just
There's a lot that goes in there. Don't get me wrong, especially when you're doing the DS. But the point is, and I really want to get to these next slides,
okay,
because
sorry.
the point is there's something very specific we need to do with these parts. Okay. All right. So what do we do? So engaging dissociate, and this is different than anything I've ever taught. This is not what I used to do. I'm trying to do this now. It's really interesting. But the IFS approach is to directly interact with the part. You don't ground, you interact. So you validate the part's protective role. So you're literally going to be sitting there with the dissociative part right there in that moment, and you're going to start dialoguing with it. So, for example, Emily, I noticed that a part of you just checked out. Are you aware of that? Let's learn why it felt the need to do that. Or further engagement. So you're the one who took Emily out a moment ago. Is that right? I trust you had a good reason for this. I'm interested in hearing more. We are literally not shifting the client out of it's actually the next slide, so I'll just read it. But we're not grounding them to get them out of the dissociation. We're not raising their heart rate. We're going to literally sit there and work with it as a part. So, and then we are looking for these parts move really slow. So IFS versus grounding techniques. And like I said, this comes from Frank's book, so I didn't write this. Grounding strategies shift focus to another part, potentially disregarding dissociative parts. That is a really powerful statement. IFS emphasizes dialogue with the dissociative part, fostering validation and understanding. And so when I use that word choice, it's coming back around because we need to talk to this part about why it chose all these things that it's doing to begin with. So let's continue because this gets even more complicated. Dissociative parts are tenacious and persistent protectors. You approach them with patience, curiosity, and respect to build trust and to facilitate healing. So what I did was I put together a chart to give us some examples because I'm learning this just like you guys are. So hyper-aroused dorsal vagal state reduces activity. It slows the body down to conserve energy. So now you've got these parts that are like sluggish, slow going, and they don't like a lot of movement. They don't have a lot to say. And so how do we engage and validate and build trust with this dissociative part? Just like we would with any protector part. Nothing has changed. So I'm just going to pick a couple of these. Sure wish I had my glasses. That would have been helpful. Oh, here they are. So I'm not going to go in the order here because I've had, I've got this practice EMDR that I'm using, and any of you can use it. And I'm working with their dissociative parts. One of their avatars, Sophie, is highly dissociative. Can't get her to do anything. And so I'm using this language to try to see if I can get her to budge. And some of it is working. So there's, for example, let's go down here at the bottom where it says nonverbal engagement. So we want to suggest a gentle nonverbal awareness because I'm telling you, when you start trying to work with these parts, they don't want anything to do with anything. And so you say, Maybe notice how your body feels right now. There's no need to talk about it yet. Or, it's okay if you're not ready to do any work. I'll be here when you are. Or what would you like me to know about why you're here? Thank you for being here and protecting Sophie. That's so important. So we literally are creating space. And I think the analogy that works best for me is you're about to embark on a path and you're standing right at the beginning of it, and the part doesn't want to move. And so you've got to create security and safety. And Susan, remember when Farnsworth does that, like, look to the left and look to the right as a way before he goes into meeting place? That's what we're doing here. It doesn't say that, but we're literally, we want to acknowledge the part. We want to notice and name its presence without any pressure. I notice a part of you has just stepped back and checked out. That's okay. I'm curious about why it felt the need to do that. Or take your time. I'm here to listen. I think one of the most important things is to tell the part that you're not here to change anything. You're not here to do anything. You just want to be with it. So what's coming up for you? Any thoughts? Okay, then let me continue. Suicidal parts is going to be an example of a part that's in that dorsal vagal energy. So every part, even suicidal parts, have a positive intention, often seeking relief from unbearable pain. These parts surface when the pain is high, and access to love, connection, and guidance is minimal or absent. So, this is difficult for us therapists because we are basically instructed on what we need to do with suicidal parts. It says cultural and professional norms are programmed to stop suicide at all costs, often overlooking the intention and pain of the suicidal part. And that's a problem because that is kind of what's required of us. Differentiating biologically based depression from a suicidal part's emotional burden is critical for effective treatment. I got to be honest with you, that sentence does not mean a thing to me. I'm not really sure what that means yet. So, but I do know how to work with suicidal parts, and I do find working with suicidal parts can be very powerful. And I know that when I introduce myself to a suicidal part, and a great way to do that is when you're doing the MID, for example, the multi-dimensional inventory of dissociation, and there's a question that specifically says, and you have a part of you that wants you to die, and you'll read the question and you'll say to the client, can you tell me a little bit about that part? You literally have an introduction right there and then to that part that wants the client to die. And all that part wants to know is that you are recognizing that it's there. It wants you to hear it. It wants you to understand it. It wants you to get it. It wants you to see it. It wants you to welcome it, to let it know that you're there for it, that it's part of the treatment, just like everything else. That is how we get these parts to calm down. And it takes a lot of guts to do that as a therapist. But that is what Frank's talking about. So engaging the suicidal part with compassion, curiosity, and open-heartedness reveals that dying is rarely the goal, that these suicidal parts often see themselves as the ultimate escape artist. At the end of the day, if you are so much pain and you cannot take it anymore, I will come in and I will end that by ending your life. That is just what that is. It's a protector part with a solution to the problem. Therapists often feel overwhelmed by responsibility, believing if I don't prevent suicide, I failed. And so there's this aspect of the different types of burdens that a client's holding. So if it's a legacy burden that can activate the therapist part, interfering with their ability to stay present. An example of would be a therapist might struggle with their own parts wanting to emphasize how devastating suicide could be. So we need to take into consideration, have you had any suicides in your past? Are your suicidal parts, do you have suicide in your past where you know what it feels like to want to die? or you've had family members that have wanted to die, or you've had other clients or friends where suicidal parts have come in. Is that being activated because of a legacy burden is an external burden, or is there an internal burden that's going to be more personal? We need to be also assessing how we, the therapist, are being affected by the client's suicidal parts. They always say, and this is what I was taught very early in my life as a therapist, is don't ever hold suicide by yourself. Make sure you get your supervisor involved, you get other therapists involved. I always say to my consultees, call me if you need to, reach out, I'll get back to you. We never want to be alone. And this is one of the reasons why, because we all do have, not all, but a lot of us have our own reactions to suicidal parts in our clients. So acknowledge and appreciate suicidal parts for their efforts and their burdens. Take these parts seriously, listening deeply to their pain and purpose without judgment or panic. When parts feel understood and supported, they tend to soften rather than escalate. And that's true. My client called me in the middle of a training. She said she had her hands around her neck. She envisioned hanging from her fan. She didn't know what to do. And I said, you tell that part that I'm teaching right now, and my lunch is in 45 minutes, and I will call and I will listen to whatever that part needs to tell me. And that in itself calmed it down. So if we treat these parts like, I say like people, if you treat these parts with respect, they will start working with you, as opposed to this pushback that we get. Therapists must address their own parts and burdens to remain present with suicidal clients. Therapy shifts from stopping suicide at all costs to engaging with the suicidal part as a compassionate something. Oh, no, it's cut off. Alternative, maybe. So protector and passive parts. So we've got a polarization that shows up when we are talking about complex trauma. Polarization is going to be two parts that are basically opposing in their views. So when vulnerability is violated by some type of trauma, you're going to have your passive part and you're going to have your perpetrator or your critical part. And these two parts are going to have, like I said, opposing views of opposing energy, opposing polyvagal energy, but they both serve as a protective mechanism, but operate in opposite ways. And so, example, I have a part that goes out and drinks because the pain is just too much. And then I have a part that says, no, you can't drink. You're getting you have a DUI and your license is going to be taken away. So these two parts are going to be a manager and a manager and a firefighter, if you want to use that language. Frank doesn't, but at the end of the day, they're two protector parts that are polarized. And we find that we have these passive and these perpetrator parts that are very polarized when working with complex trauma. So I'm just going to read off the characteristics for the two. The passive parts are generally directly from exile energy. And the majority of exiles come from dorsal vagal shutdown. So the majority of exile parts are dissociative. Messages include, I'm too run down to respond. If I stay quiet, I won't draw attention or get hurt. I learned helplessness or passivity. It helps to avoid harm. There is a parasympathetic blunting or withdrawal. So there we are. I've got my polyvagal traffic light there. These parts are in red. They often present as an inability to speak up or advocate for one's needs. And what is the therapist? How do they get activated? These parts can trigger a therapist's own protective or rescue parts, requiring therapists to remain present and grounded. I have a client that is just shut down all the time. And it's just so frustrating. It doesn't matter what I do. And it's not about what I do. It's about working with the part. And it's really slow going because these parts that are in this dorsal vagal energy, they don't want anything to do with you. And you literally have to sit with them and be present with them for them to trust you. And I totally understand why this client's parts doesn't trust me, because I have an agenda, I'm losing patients, and that part can pick up on it. Perpetrator parts, complete opposite. This is sympathetic energy. So when we have our dorsal vagal shutdown, we have a reduction in heart rate, a reduction in blood pressure. You have opiates. The endorphins are working with the opiate receptors. You have a numbing out and a reduction in pain. But when you have a perpetrator part, it's the opposite. It's sympathetic energy, yellow. It's going to have an increased heart rate. It's going to have increased blood pressure. If I attack first, no one will hurt me. It's a mix of the client's internal heart and energy taken from that perpetrator. They always say that if you look at a perpetrator, if you unzip the costume, there's always a little child in there. Often a mix of the client's internal energy. I just read that. Legacy burdens can be released to reduce the energy's influence. And this is another IFS piece. You can literally find the exile and you can release the burdens that come from others. And you can let go of it. You can give it back. You can have a ceremony. It's really powerful. And so connecting with perpetrator parts can evoke shame because it's like, I can't believe I've acted just like my abuser, but it happens all the time. And we want to normalize it. We want to validate it. We want to welcome it. Like, oh my gosh, welcome. How are you? Yeah, you do act like the perpetrator. And that's what saved your life the whole time you lived with that perpetrator. So, once again, you can pull in Daniel Siegel's Name It to Tame It, et cetera, et cetera. But we want to welcome and validate and appreciate and acknowledge our perpetrator parts, no matter what they do. And that's something that you've got to figure out if you're good with. Internal critics often attack perpetrator parts, creating further polarization. So you've got the passive part that wants to hide. You have the perpetrator part that wants to attack. And then you have the critical part that's going to be critical of the perpetrator part and its behaviors. So once again, complex trauma, layers and layers and layers of these parts. So working with the critical parts, we need to understand them. They're very common. Critical parts are everywhere. Critical parts are rooted in judgment. They're rooted in verbal abuse. My client that comes in and says, I'm so lazy and I'm so fat and I just, and I'm like, oh yeah, right. Who called you that? Well, Dad calls me that all the time. So it's literally the voices of those that abused our clients. And we're talking about complex trauma. So we're going to have a lot of critical voices in our head. Number 27 on the DES. Do you hear voices in your head? I'm so lazy, or you're so lazy, you'll never amount to anything. These attacks can feel like an assault on the soul, causing deep emotional harm. And the reason they're there is because the client heard it over and over and over and over again from people that were supposed to be their attachment, that were supposed to keep them safe and protect them. Critical parts are positive and have positive intentions, often trying to protect the client. If I tell my client, if I tell the client, be perfect, don't stumble again, get out there, you got to do this better, you got to do this better, you got to do this better. What is the intention? What is the reason why that this protector part needs to be so persistent? Is it to keep the client alive? Is it to make sure the client has some type of attachment? Is it to get their needs met in service of survival? Yeah, it is. Silencing the vulnerability or the pain, that's not going to be helpful, but that is the goal of the critical part. And then when we look at criticizing, if it's a manager critical part, it's looking to maintain or prevent harm. But if it's a firefighter critical part, it's reacting to some type of pain or harm. So we always think about like everything's a protector part, but the managers are about the future and the firefighters are about now. So if you've got a firefighter that drinks and you have a manager that says, nope, you can't drink, you're going to be in trouble. And if you do drink, you're a loser. So it's all of these parts that we are going to generally be looking to work with. Healing the perpetrator and the passive parts. How do we do it? Well, we want to appreciate them. We want to show compassion toward them. I like to use hugs. I hear you. I understand you. I get you. I see you. We want to welcome them, appreciate, accept, acknowledge, build trust, no matter what these perpetrator parts do or what these passive parts do. So we help the client differentiate these parts. Legacy burdens is a whole other chapter, so we're not going to really get into that, luckily, because I don't know a whole lot about that, but I will. Teaching gratitude for these parts, trying to get the client's higher self on board so that they can appreciate what it is that these parts did in order to keep the client safe. Reframing internal critics, guiding the client to see internal critics as protectors of the child parts, preventing harm from perpetrator rage. So every, client comes in and he blackout drinks and he ends up hitting his girlfriend. And then when he was a kid, he was hit all the time. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there because we've got a blackout, which is going to be, highly dissociative with some type of amnestic piece. And then you've got the part that got activated that basically learned how to do these things from dad. And so I don't want to say that's not on the client, but we need the client to be empowered with the psychoeducation before we can go in and really start working with these parts. So both passive and perpetrator parts are protective mechanisms born from trauma. Healing involves listening to their positive intentions, addressing the burdens, and helping the client develop compassion for all parts of the system. So once again, I just want to kind of throw in there the difference between, working with IFS and working with other orientations. We treat these parts like they are all separate because, well, they are all separate. Whereas when you're working with ego states, for example, it is all one, right? And so these parts are fluid and they're going to be constantly changing, and we're developing relationships with them. When we're working with ego states or transactional analysis or structural dissociation, the therapist is the facilitator, creating relationships amongst the parts. So once again, we're integrating them. It doesn't matter, but I just have to put that out there because there is a difference between the two. But it doesn't matter. You can do one and you can do the other, and that's basically what we do, right? Relationship approaches to critics. So Chris Burris, I'd never heard of him, but he's a senior IFS trainer, emphasizes the relational techniques of critics. Where did you learn to do this job is a really big question. So when we're looking for past present connection, I always say you weren't born doing this. Where did this come from? Where did you learn this? Where did you see this? Where was this mentored for you? And then would you be open to discovering new ways of helping? Because critics often feel misunderstood, shamed, or belittled because usually what they do is something that is not acceptable. All right. But we want to change that perspective. We want to be helping the client understand that this came from somewhere. It's encoded because somebody else did it. Like I said, you're not just born with it. So we want to connect to these parts with kindness, with curiosity. When I had my client that was very distraught about working at the school, we went over where this came from, why this happened, why it's completely normal to have these feelings. And so how the brain works and how neuronal bundles basically duplicate and copy what it is that's done to them in order to protect themselves. And that doesn't make the client a bad person. It makes the client traumatized. And so we need to work with that. And the first thing we need to do is be accepting and loving on these parts that are so rejected by everybody, including the client. And this allows for a deeper access to the real wound inflicted by the original perpetrator. Because at the end of the day, it is the original perpetrator. And that client, like I said, you unzip that perpetrator costume and inside there is a shivering, terrified little child. And it gives us like the ability to look at these parts from a completely different perspective. The healing comes through self-connection, understanding, and integrating the efforts of all parts, especially the critics. So once again, we're just kind of looking at these layers and layers and layers of parts. And this is the last slide for this. And I know a lot of words. I was going to put pictures in here, but I'm like, you know what? There are no pictures. This is language that we have to learn. The polarization between the parts, it's the trauma that causes the polarization. So you've got the passive part that's trying to avoid, maybe hiding under the table, trying to deter others or defer others, wanting that to try to stay safe by staying out of sight. So out of sight, out of mind. Whereas the critical parts are pushing aggressively to prevent. So a critical part would be like the part that's going to be critical to the client to not execute the behavior that they learn from the perpetrator or learn from the abusing parent. So the polarities reflect these internal conflicts, like I'm stuck between fighting too hard and stepping back completely. The first thing we do is we get these two parts to understand each other, to see each other's perspective, to see each other's point of view. Passive part is like, well, if I hide, then I don't have to interact with what's going on. And then the part over here is saying, well, if I act just like dad, he's going to align with me and I'll align with him and I'll get our needs met. And it's not that they have to agree. It's just that they have to understand each other. So internal family systems really helps with this. We want to join and hear both sides of the polarity. And we want to validate the efforts of all the parts and then offer a release for the anguish that they've been protecting. So in other words, what we're doing is literally couples therapy. You've got a very passive part and you've got a very aggressive part. And they're both on the couch and they're both in front of you and you can't side with either. You can't say, well, this one doesn't get as much trouble as this one, because then you're triangling. And so you need the two parts to be able to see each other's perspective, to be able to hear, understand, get, and see. They don't have to agree. Like the passive part doesn't have to say, well, I really do appreciate it when you go and you punch the guy out. No, but we have to understand why. And so if the part says, well, I learned to punch people out because dad used to punch me all the time and that's all I know. And then the passive part's like, oh, I see how that works. Not saying, oh, good, you go punch that person out. It's, I understand why you punch that person out. And then the critical part or the imitator part's going to do the same thing with passive. I can see why you hid under that table, because when you hid under that table, dad wouldn't see you and then you wouldn't have gotten hurt. So the goal is for them to share their story. The goal is for them to be able to agree. And then once you can validate all of those efforts, then we're going to go into what it is that we can do to start working with the two, because they're both protecting a very young child part, and you can't get to that young child part until you've worked with the polarization. The emotions inform our truth and connect us to what's right. So at the end of the day, it is a beautiful therapy session. That's just like I said, it's like a couples therapy session in that you're working with two parts that are on different sides, not getting along in the beginning. This chapter was super important, and I'm not going to have time to get into the substance use, so I am going to tack it onto the next one because it is so important. But the reason why substance use comes up next is because when you're working with substance use, you are working with polarized parts. You're going to have the part that uses, and then you're going to have the part that says you can't use because you're going to get kicked out. Your wife's going to divorce you. You're going to lose your job. And we need to figure out how these two are going to get along before we can get anywhere. And once these two get along, then you can go in and find what it is that they're protecting, that 3-year-old little wounded part. And then that is where the recovery comes in. And it's complicated. We have a lot of, 1 in 10 of somebody who goes into a treatment center walk out of there with some sense of sobriety. But for the most part, you have to do an average of 5 treatment centers before you can really get to through to an addiction. And so at the end of the day, maybe this will be a different way that we can be working with these clients that would be more successful. And so I really want to do some due diligence here for this chapter. And I like the idea of doing substance use and shame back to back. So we've got a couple minutes, and I'm just going to get some feedback on what you're thinking.
Hey,
Yeah.
Paula, just I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. How
Okay.
does that sound? Everybody, great job. I did have